Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. Thank you, everybody, for attending this webinar. Ectobox and Spruik, we're getting together to do another webinar in this series of webinars for the Unified Namespace, the UNS. Let's do some introductions. Let's talk about the webinar, and then let's get on with the fun. This is going to be, I was just telling the guys, and I'm actually personally excited about this one. This is going to be really cool to dig into the back end. So we have with us Dave Schultz from Spruik Technologies, Frank Galuska, and myself, both from Ectobox. And we're going to talk about the inner workings of the unified namespace and how to execute it using OEE, how to get data from a PLC, turn that into OEE, get into the namespace, and actually display it on a screen. So we'll be getting into a little bit of Ignition stuff. So with that said, just to set the context, if this is your first time here, this is a series. We've gone through other webinars so far. Those should be available in YouTube. Please feel free to check those videos out here. Kyan, if you could in the background, mind sharing a link to our YouTube channel. That'd be a good idea. Also, feel free to subscribe to our YouTube channel. So we've talked initially in the first one about the UNS concepts. The second one was let's get data from a machine and let's dig into it. And then we broke out actually a 2A and a 2B section to dig into more details about the UNS and how it works. Now we're getting our hands dirty, which is going to be great. We're in number 3, and we're going to get it into an MES application. This is what our UNS or Unified Namespace looks like so far. I'll explain the circles in just a second. What we're doing is connecting to a PLC. This is a simulated PLC here for a bottling line, and that's supposed to be a bottling machine there. We're going to get data from that PLC, get it into Ignition, which is going to be our IoT and MES platform, process it to get some OEE, what am I thinking? And then get the data into a data broker, and then have it available in the data broker to subscribe to it in Canary. We'll go through step by step the process of getting the data from our edge namespace, actually from the PLC, and then from the edge namespace and get it into the functional namespace for OEE. I have a diagram here which breaks things out a little bit more, where we're going to go through step by step, getting the data from the PLC into the gateway in Ignition. From there, we'll see the data in the tag browser. And then from there, be able to process that data with some Python code in Ignition. The data is also going to land, it's going to land into a database, to a MySQL database. We'll be taking a look at that. And then eventually the data is going to land into the UNS and also into our UI UX layer within Ignition to be able to display a little simple chart with the OEE values. And then from there, we'll also be able to have the data available for pulling out of the data broker and into Canary. So with that said, Frank, I'm going to stop sharing here, and Frank, can you share your screen with the operator screen, and we'll start from there?
Yeah, let me go ahead and share my screen. All right.
So we'll see the data land in that chart way up in the top right side of things. So do you want to start, Frank, with the getting into Ignition, into the designer, and talking about the OEE UDTs and tag browser?
Yeah, let me flip over to the Ignition designer here. And you can see in sort of the left-hand pane here my UDT definitions. So I have the two sort of key ones to focus on today are the line and the OEE downtime definition, right? So the OEE downtime is really where a lot of the OEE functionality and MES functionality is going to come in. So you can see some of the tags we have set up here for our different count types, start times, end times, work order, different types of downtime, planned versus unplanned, production rates, and of course, your components of OEE itself and the overall value. So with this being a UDT, naturally we can use this inside of other UDTs. So we have this line UDT here, which has some of the more detailed edge information that we went over in past webinars, right? So things like our in-feed, our out-feed, cycle time, that sort of thing, set points. And we have a instance of this OEE downtime in this line UDT called OEE. So if we expand that, we can see that same definition set up here, and that's usable in not only this line, but other UDTs as well, and other instances of this UDT that we create.
So you're taking a UDT definition that you've created ahead of time for OEE, and then you are, I don't want to say instantiating, but using an instance of that for the line, which then gives you that basic template and saves a lot of time creating a lot of stuff from scratch. Is that fair?
Yeah, and we have, sort of an instance of the OEE UDT, like you said, in the definition of the line UDT. So when we go and make a new line, it's making a instance of both of those UDTs at once.
All right. So then we have that set up already. Then the next step I think we want to get into is then how we're getting the data in. So data's in a PLC. We want to pull it in. How does that work? What's the next step?
Yeah, so I mean that's all done through the Ignition gateway. So you can configure different OPC clients and connections here. So the Siemens S7-1200 that I have set up, just a simple connection here with the host name, and that's really what's driving the in-feed and out-feed of this simulation.
So then where does the data go?
Yeah, so once we have that connection set up, it is available. I'll just make a new tag real quick here. So a OPC tag, for example, and I have that OPC server S7-1200, and I can add my tags that way, bring in my in-feed, my out-feed, and configure any scripting events or anything along those lines that are needed with that tag. So that again, that's really what's driving these functions here, and sort of the starting off point for this whole namespace and OEE functionality.
Just a quick aside, it looks like there's some challenges with resolution. It looks fairly clear on our end. I think it could be a little crisper, but I don't know that we can do anything right now amidst the webinar for it. So just for the crowd, if you don't mind, apologies for that, and maybe squint a little bit to see a little bit more clearly. We'll see if we can address that in a future session. All right, so then what happens next? So this data gets into the edge namespace, tag event fires, script runs, and then the data ends up into the database, right?
Yeah, that's right. So something like outfeed, for example, anytime that changes, we're going to trigger a tag event that will record that change and put it into our MySQL database that we're running in the back end. And a important distinction there that we'll actually touch on a little bit later as well is, we're not just recording the raw value for the in-feed and the out-feed. We're actually recording the change in those numbers in order to account for any, differences between how we want to record the data and how the PLC is presenting the data, right? So we care about tracking things against certain production runs or shifts, whereas the PLC, isn't really going to reset every production run, right? The counter might just keep running, and we don't want to have a starting out-feed count of 350, for example.
Mm-hmm. Right. So then do you have, so the script runs to get the data into the database, into the count history table. and then I'd say let's hop over to the database real quick to take a look at that, and then we can look at the code for getting that value out and all the rest of that.
Yeah, so you can see some of the tables we have here. We mentioned the count history. I'll just do a simple select.
So you're in the MySQL workbench at this point.
Yes. Sorry, not. Let me go. So yeah, if we go for run, for example, you can see the start date and time currently isn't stopping the in feed, the out feed here, the waste, those types of things.
Okay.
Any unplanned downtime, whether or not the run is still active or not. And same thing, if we go to like the site table or the enterprise table, we can see that UNS architecture as well, right? So enterprise and then site has a reference to the enterprise as a parent ID and that foreign key relationship we have set up.
So what we're looking at is count history table that we saw where the data is going, and then you're talking about that ISA architecture of enterprise site area line cell that we use in the UNS, and that data is stored in tables, separate tables, enterprise table, site table, etc., and they are related to one another in that fashion with relational databases between a primary key and a foreign key, and that then gives you the flexibility to set up all kinds of sites and locations and assets, areas and assets and all the rest of that kind of stuff. Is that a good way to go ahead?
So a good example of that is the line table here, right? So we have multiple lines all related to that one area by parent ID 3, right?
Okay. All right. So then let's go back to, so we have talked about PLC, data comes out of the PLC, lands into the gateway, and then a tag event fires, which runs a script. That data is then recorded into the count history table, which we saw very quickly. Now we want to actually use that value and start to work with it. So what are we looking at? How does it work at this point? Is this where we look at the good count function?
Yeah. So a little bit of background. We have two separate Ignition projects set up here, and one being essentially just a starting point that is a code base. So we can dive into some of the different OEE functions here, and one of those being, as you mentioned, Kevin, the get good count, right? So function here takes in a couple of parameters such as tag paths and start times, tag IDs, count IDs, that type of thing, as well as what database to actually query against. So here, just going through defining the query where we're getting information from that count history table, and going through and essentially, accumulating that change just in a for loop for everything against the current production run.
Good. So Dave, I'm going to throw out some questions to you in a second. So after this, then Frank, the idea is that so we're reading the value and figuring out what counts are good counts, and then we're going to start to use that data to actually perform calculations to figure out what the OEE values actually are. Is that right?
Yeah, that's right. So this is just one of the functions we have in this sort of library of code here. So some of the other ones, of course, being just an overall get OEE function where we're calling other functions such as calc quality, calc availability, and performance, and then actually writing those values back into the tag browser in our default.
Okay. So why don't you grab one of those, open up one of those and take a look at that calculations. And then Dave, I'm going to ask for your perspective on this kind of setup, highlights, the good, the bad, the ugly, whatever it might be. So yeah, availability, quality, something there. Yeah, there's availability right there. So can you talk through the code a little bit?
Yeah. So for we'll stick with quality because we're talking with good counts, right?
Oh,
so yeah, with quality, we're again bringing in tag paths for both the good and the actual where we're going to end up writing the OEE quality in the future. And we're just simply comparing, the number of good counts to the overall counts, right? So we're just doing a simple try calculation here, where we're just getting that ratio to good counts to overall counts. If for some reason we get some abnormal value, we're going to set the quality to 1, just as like a safety net. And then here, the system.tag.write blocking is where we're actually writing that value into our OEE quality tag here.
So that system.tag.write blocking is
Mm-hmm.
the final piece, if you will,
Yep. Yep.
where it actually gets into the tag browser and effectively into our local version of the UNS. Is that fair?
Yeah, exactly. And then from, with these two parameters, we're passing into that write blocking function, which is just a built-in Ignition function. We're telling it essentially, here is the path to write, the OE quality path, which we're passing into the function itself,
Mm-hmm.
and then our calculated quality here using the good count and total count.
Nice, good. So, Dave, what are your thoughts on this whole structure and setup? Good, the bad, etc.
Yeah, so I actually wanted to take a quick step back for people that are on the call that might not be
Thank you.
familiar with OEE and what we're doing here with the UNS. So Frank earlier was talking about this, so-called edge namespace, and the edge namespace is what we've so far taken a look at, and I think where a lot of people understand what a UNS is. It's largely these PLC tag values. The intent of this webinar is to take a look at what are some of the other functions. There's real-time events. Well, OEE is an event within a manufacturing process, and an OEE engine does a calculation of what is your availability, your performance, and your quality that is on a line. So when we talk about the APQ, and then of course OEE being the combined product of those three values, that's what we're calculating. So the tool itself is taking a look, and it's running every 60 seconds, every 30 seconds. And it's now running all of these functions that Frank has shown you here, and it's making that calculation and reporting those values back into that unified namespace. The intent is that in real time, what the current OEE and its constituent components of availability, production, or performance and quality are, and that information in real time. And I know we're getting a little ahead of ourselves, but we're also historizing that so you can do all kinds of analysis, so you can slice and dice it. In terms of how you're applying it here, there is a ton of abstraction that has been done in this particular build. And what I mean by that is, rather than hard coding everything, even down to the database name itself, you're now referencing other components so that as you build out and extend it. So, this is something we talk a lot about, is I can solve a problem, but can I extend it and can I scale it? And by building in a lot of this abstractions, so you can just pass parameters in, makes it a lot more easy, or makes it easier to scale as well as extend, because now you just add on the functionality.
Yeah, good. Thank you for adding the context, the stepping back. Like I told you guys before we started here, I'm so excited. Like, I want to see the code.
Kind of dive right in. Yeah. No, that's good.
Thank you.
So I just want to make sure we're on that.
It's all good. That's good stuff. And the idea around passing in variables, using variables for path names, etc., requires a bit of forethought in the design of a system like this. But once you do it, yes, adds extreme flexibility, scalability.
Mm-hmm. And just to kind of tie back into our UDT definitions, having sort of consistent naming structures there help with that as well, right? So we always have, for example, the OEE instance of that UDT inside of a line, then passing in those different tag paths become pretty trivial.
Yeah.
Sure. Yeah, and one of the things that I want to point out in the model that you have here is that it now means every instance of line, which is that hierarchy, what I call the hierarchy UDT, means every line will always have this OEE calculation. That's part of this namespace that, from a data governance standpoint, we're going to enforce. If you have a line, you are going to have OEE on that line, because that is, it's critical to our quality. It's critical to our manufacturing process, there's a reason why you have it, so you can enforce it.
Yeah, good stuff. That makes sense. All right, Frank, let's continue on. Now that we've looked at the data where it's stored, we've pulled the data out, we've run some calculations, we've sent the data up to the UNS, up to the tag browser in the UNS. At this point, I think the next step is the display. Let's look at the UI.
Yeah, so as I mentioned before, flipping over to that other project, this second project here with the actual displays and everything is inheriting that all those scripts. So, it is, as Dave mentioned, running those calculations every 60 seconds, updating our UNS structure, and then we can, as Kevin said, use those in displays like this one I have open here.
So this display, this is in Vision. We can talk about why we're using Vision here versus Perspective in a little bit, but to kind of cut to it, we're getting, this is what I call a WYSIWYG development environment. What you see is what you get, up to the point of even seeing live data updates too. So now you're going to start to tear apart, so to speak, the how to get the data into the OEE side of things.
Yeah, so I have a template here in Ignition that is my OEE sort of components, and this is built from different components over here in the palette at Ignition. So just some simple bar graphs for our 3 qualities and the overall value. And if I sort of minimize my tag browser here, I have my property editor down here in the bottom left. So you can see I clicked on performance, and the custom property of calc value that's being used to display that has a binding, and you can tell that by the little sort of paperclip or chain link icon over there. So in order to use these bindings or values from our UNS, we can set up these bindings, and again we're using that indirect tag path here. So we're passing in a overall OEE.line tag path sort of parameter into here, and then that gets resolved to match whatever line we're currently looking at. So, think of this one up here as, essentially a variable or placeholder that will direct it all the way down. I had to close that to get back here, all the way down to this line. And then line, and then from there it goes OEE and again performance, right? So that's sort of how that is resolving and being displayed. And that line tag path relates to the operations drop down up here as well.
So similar to how you were abstracting the overall calculation and the functionality, you're abstracting the visualization. So that regardless of what line I'm on,
yep,
it will dynamically populate. Is that right?
Yeah, exactly. So if you have multiple lines, you can select and sort of flip through those views very easily with this drop down. And because of the way the UNS is structured and the UDTs are defined, we're always going to have that OEE instance inside of the line and the OEE performance inside of OEE.
Sure.
I think back to when I started development too many years ago. For people who are newer to Ignition, just conceptually, I didn't know what I was doing way back when I was a junior plebe-like developer, hard coding things into the code here and there and everywhere else, and then started to realize, this is pretty restrictive. I've built up what I didn't know at the time was technical debt, and to make a change, I'd have to change, make the change in a whole bunch of places. And so we're simply being really intelligent about our development in this tool and setting up the word that Dave used earlier, setting up the abstractions, using templates, using UDTs, definitions, all the rest of that to make a really nice flexible solution that we can change pretty quickly. Nice. Mm-hmm. Good. All right. So we have gone through the process of getting the data from the PLC all the way through the gateway, tag browser, database, scripts running, database, then reading that data to get the good count, and then using the good count in the one you showed us in some of the OEE calculations like quality, etc. Then write it to the tag browser, lands in the UNS. Then we look at our UI template here, so to speak, and then with that the bar tool component, actually bind it to that particular tag. Data displays, we're good to go. The data needs to land in the UNS into the data broker, and then hopefully land in some other system, because that's the idea of this unified namespace. It's a single version of the truth where we can have multiple nodes in the whole system, where we're publishing data into that UNS, then using that data in other places. And one of the places that we have in our diagram, and we're going to start to build this out over the subsequent webinars, is to consume that data or subscribe to that data and get the data into Canary and eventually into other systems like a CMMS, et cetera. So you want to talk a little bit about getting the data into through transmission into the data broker and then, Canary?
Yeah, so let me log into the gateway here. So yeah, as you mentioned, Kevin, there's some pretty nice MQTT modules that Ignition has that are actually developed by Cirrus Link. The three being MQTT engine, transmission, and the distributor, which itself is essentially a data broker. So for this example, as you mentioned, the transmission is sort of the star of the show, right? It's the way you make relationships between what you have in your Ignition tag browser and topic paths that you're writing to the data broker itself. So I have a couple of examples here. I can actually create a new one, just HiveMQ, for example, and I have a instance up in HiveMQ's cloud running. So I can let me double check the username. Okay, it is just Ignition.
Should be strong password, I think, Dave.
Strong password, that's right.
Exactly.
Unless you need a stronger password, then it's stronger password. That's right.
So once we have that server connection set up, we can actually define our transmitters. And what the transmitters do is what I just mentioned. It's making that physical connection between the data broker and Ignition. So, for example, I'll just call this one webinar. Tag provider will be default, and then the tag path, I'll actually just go into Ignition here, and I should be able to copy that path of enterprise site area line 1. Get rid of the tag provider because we defined it up above. And from there, we can actually define our group ID, edge node, and device ID as well. Oh, maybe if I don't typo default, that will help.
Murphy.
The risks of doing it live.
Mm-hmm. So essentially what we're defining there is we're telling it to publish anything in the tag provider of enterprise site area line 1 to the using the ID of Ectobox. And then from there, that will go up to our data broker that we have set up, and we can go into Canary and configure the MQTT collector, again, to connect to that same data broker, bring in data, historize it, and start analyzing it with their Axiom tool.
So do you have the MQTT Explorer open to see the values coming through?
I can open it up here. I have it locally.
Just want to be able to see it actually land in the data broker to prove, look, see, it works.
Right.
While he's doing that, Dave, any other thoughts about what we're putting together here?
Yeah, no, I think just on that transmitter piece, one of the areas that sometimes is, I don't want to say it causes confusion, maybe that's a little strong word, but how you actually put together your ID. So within the spark plug payload, you have to have a group ID, a node ID, and a device ID. And within this particular tool, when you give it the tag path, if you don't define those, so you'll notice that when Frank put together that path, he just called it the Ectobox as the group, but didn't put anything in the node or the device IDs. And that's because Ignition in this case will dynamically set those based on what it finds in terms of a folder in that path.
Mm-hmm.
So, what's nice about this particular tool is that you can navigate anywhere within your, I would call it the local namespace, and then propagate that into that unified namespace or that enterprise namespace. So, just getting, reinforcing the idea that a unified namespace is a bunch of namespaces that are then combined to create a unified namespace. And there's some nifty tricks that tips and tricks you can use at least within this particular application in order to get there.
And for those that are new to some of these concepts around namespace, would recommend going back to the first and second videos that we have in this webinar series, and other videos that we have too, again, on our YouTube channel, to go through some of those basic or foundational ideas. They're really interesting, how this kind of architecture provides a lot of flexibility and scalability.
Sure.
Frank, you nearly there, or should we keep chatting?
No, for some reason Ignition's not connecting.
Okay.
Well, yeah, I think it's because you've defined the same namespace, and so what it's assuming is that one's a primary and one's a backup.
Okay.
So if you notice on line 1N webinar, you have the same. Now it looks like you have changed that set.
I have, yeah. Okay. I can always just disable that one as well.
Yeah, we'll see what happens. Still doesn't like it.
Yeah.
Well, I'd say let's move on. Yeah. The idea was simply to show a basic web application, the MQTT Explorer, that simply shows you the data coming through the data broker itself. We've done this countless times and have lots of live instances of this kind of stuff running, but doing things on the fly is always interesting for a webinar. But suffice it to say, it works. If anybody's interested in seeing that remaining details, let us know. I'm happy to do another video or jump on a quick live call to show you how it works.
Actually, I think Kevin, you and I recorded a video just maybe 10 days ago showing this exact thing.
Did we do that part? I guess we did. Yeah, you're right. Mm-hmm. Okay, go back to the third video, part 2B, and you'll actually be able to see the Explorer, the MQTT Explorer. All right, so with that, we've gone through the whole process of data from PLC all the way through to into UNS, into data broker, and theoretically it gets into the data broker, and we could show it to you. Just look at part 2B. Now that we've gone through that, there are a couple other nuances that Frank thought, a couple ideas to talk about. And Frank, I'd say maybe go back to the designer to show at least this one for the MES core project and the idea of this code. So it has to do with where do you manage your code, essentially?
Yeah, so, like we mentioned earlier in the webinar, all of this code is housed in a separate Ignition project that is inheritable, that, each subsequent Ignition project we create that we need this functionality, we can inherit it, and it's right there for us to call these functions on, whatever timer or however often we would like. The other option, instead of doing it that way, would be to have sort of a external, Python code pre-developed, and then we can actually, import that library into Ignition through managing some files and, copying, pasting some things and making sure everything's in the right spot. So if we wanted to manage our code base sort of externally from Ignition entirely, we could do that as well.
So it becomes an external library of code effectively, and then you do an import statement, much like you could do in Java and C# and all the rest of that, to get that that whole library available to you to work with then.
Exactly. Yeah. Actually, up here, import. We're running an import statement at the top of this sort of
Mm-hmm.
OEE code as well. But we can, effectively do that with this whole library if we wanted to import all these functions into Ignition.
Right. And then that enables you to use that code in other tools as well. We talk about Factory Studio as another great development environment for doing a solution like this. So same concepts apply. You guys want to talk about that a little bit?
Yeah. So in that case, yeah, if we manage our code base externally, we can use it elsewhere outside of Ignition. You mentioned Factory Studio, another platform where you can, sort of bring in code externally, run scripts externally. So we could do that. Or if you wanted to, get really custom and build your own, front end and everything, you could do that as well.
Yep, fair. So a couple other questions. One, vision versus perspective. You want to talk through why we're using vision right now? Certainly some people in this call are thinking to themselves, well, isn't vision like old school and perspective is new school, HTML5 and that kind of thing?
Yeah, and that's certainly, perspective is what everything's kind of leaning towards. And we do have plans on, updating this demo to, be perspective pages instead of vision pages but for now, for sort of quick development and, demo purposes, it's really nice to just kind of, storyboard, if you will, in vision and kind of get things up and running and then convert it over and work out the finer details of setting up in perspective later.
And the idea is, and Dave, feel free to correct me if I'm wrong too, the idea is that perspective will continue to mature as a development environment and become as easy to develop in as vision is, but vision is a bit faster development than convert things over. Is that kind of the principle?
I would say sort of. I mean, so perspective is it's a website. So if you're familiar with web development and doing the front end, then it becomes very familiar. You have a lot of different containers that you utilize within perspective. It's not as easy as the drag and drop of what you see is what you get, as you mentioned earlier. You have to think through what it is you're trying to do. What do you want? How responsive do you want that particular view or web page to look? But once that's understood, then it's really not that really not much different, because you can do all the same types of bindings and abstractions and passing them in parameters. There's a lot of functionality that you get that way. It's just, fundamentally starts from the idea you're developing a web page. You're not developing, we'll call it a SCADA screen, if you will.
Right. One of the other questions that has come up that we were talking about as well is, Frank, you had alluded to this at the beginning. Why are you storing the delta value rather than the raw value?
Yeah, so I, touched on that earlier, but just to kind of reinforce the point, the counter in, whatever device, PLC, that we're getting that in-feed and out-feed from, it might not have sort of the same time parameters that we're looking for, right? It might not care about when shifts start and end. It might not reset in between them, that type of thing. And, we don't want to be, that's how we're focusing on the data and calculating OEE is on a, per run basis. So we don't want to have to worry about that. And, having, like I said earlier, having our run start with an in-feed of, anything but 0. So we just want to capture the delta so we know exactly what's happening during that run.
Good. That's all the questions that we have from us and also from the audience, from the group that's here. Let's start to wrap this up, and then I'll talk a little bit about what the next session is going to be like. Dave, do you have any comments about what we've gone over? Anything to highlight or?
Yeah, no, it's a really nice development, and I'll just bring up the whole idea of is if you're setting out to do something like this in terms of building your own engine, the best practice is just start by writing the code and then abstract it as much as you can, even up to what Frank was talking about at the very end of even abstracting all the Python libraries so it exists outside of the tool. That's just a best practice of, we want to connect our intelligence to technology, not necessarily solutions. And that's just an architecture balance. And then the other piece is, we referenced this other webinar, just understand that now we can start historizing all this information. And that to me is really where you start to get the value, because you can look at your overall trends and how your overall system is, what's its overall performance, what's its availability, what's the quality, what's happening. And you can start comparing apples to apples.
Yeah. So one of the next sessions, or the next session, is going to be around a CMMS and how to integrate with a CMMS into this whole idea of a unified namespace, that a CMMS is going to be another one of those nodes in the ecosystem. And there will be a namespace for maintenance work order and other pieces. And then subsequent to that, maybe the next one after that will be, I don't remember what the list is, but maybe start to get into data analysis. We'll use something like Flow software to pull the data out and run some interesting calculations and visualizations of the data. Maybe eventually in this series get to pulling the data into a BI platform as well. Those are what we're doing with this series, is effectively to show people with the unified namespace the affordability, flexibility, scalability, and, well, I guess maybe kind of the usability, like how to actually use it and implement it to solve a whole bunch of different problems. Because the idea is, when you're talking about digital transformations for companies, to help companies move from automating their machines and the data that's trapped in those machines to actually automating the business itself and how it operates in that transition, let's solve actual business problems. Let's educate people. Let's define the strategy and the architectures, and let's actually solve problems. And so that's what the series is about, solving problems.
Very cool.
Anything else, guys, to summarize or wrap up?
No.
All right.
No, looks good. So well done.
Yeah, awesome. Thank you, Frank. Thank you, David. Really appreciate you guys being here, and appreciate everybody attending as well. Please reach out if you have any further questions, want to chat about any aspect of this video, this webinar, or any of the others. Also, check out our YouTube channel, I guess, and subscribe, like, all that kind of fun stuff. And we will be reaching out to you to let you know when the next one's going to be. Thank you very much.
All right. Awesome. Thank you, everybody, for your time.
See you. Thank you.